With just a week between races, there wasn't a lot of news to report on from around the world, though the International Olympic Committee agreed to readmit South Africa to the Olympics in time to take part in the 1992 Games. And a day later, President Bush announced the end of US economic sanctions, following the lead of the European community earlier in the year. With the end of apartheid in sight, it looked like the sporting isolation of South Africa might also be coming to an end. The country's football association had reformed itself as a multiracial organisation and was applying for readmission to FIFA. The International Cricket Council restored Test status to South Africa later in July, and while the Springboks would obviously have to sit out the Rugby World Cup later in 1991, they were expected to be back for the 1995 edition. All that being the case, the owners of the Kyalami circuit would no doubt be on the phone to Bernie Ecclestone too. And just before the French Grand Prix, Terminator 2 Judgment Day had hit US cinemas, proving a colossal critical and commercial hit, and its pioneering use of computer-generated imagery, a lot of which still holds up over 30 years later, has made it influential on cinema as a whole ever since. It was a tricky time for the film industry in the early 90s, with costs spiralling as big stars asked for ever bigger contracts, shares of the profits and so on, while the box office was declining with the emergence of the home video market, none of which was helped by a global financial downturn. Other films released in the summer of 1991 included Bruce Willis' adventure Hudson Hawk, a famous flop in the States but actually better received overseas, Ridley Scott's road movie Thelma and Louise, bafflingly pitched as a screwball comedy by its trailers,
his butt.
Billy Crystal's western comedy City Slickers, black comedy Don't Tell Mom the Babysitter's Dead, more Frank Drebin antics in The Naked Gun 2.5 The Smell of Fear, and, in my opinion, criminally underrated period comic book movie The Rocketeer, which, despite underperforming at the box office, did influence Marvel's decision 2 full decades later to hand director Joe Johnston the reins of Captain America the First Avenger. Apart from Terminator 2, however, the big hit of the summer season was Kevin Costner's Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, in which our Kev fights against, in no particular order, English history, English geography, the English accent, and Alan Rickman's gloriously hammy Sheriff of Nottingham. The film included the role of Morgan Freeman as Robin's Middle Eastern ally Azim, who had accompanied him home from the Crusade. The filmmakers believed this to be a stock character alongside Friar Tuck and Maid Marian, but in fact it was an idea invented for mid-80s British TV series Robin of Sherwood. Costner's film also notably featured the song Everything I Do It For You by Bryan Adams, which was entering its 5th week at number 1 in the UK as the crowd started arriving for the British Grand Prix, and would clock up a record 16 weeks at number 1 before finally being knocked off by U2's The Fly at the end of October. Because the UK still had to wait for the American releases because the physical film reels needed shipping across the Atlantic, on British Grand Prix weekend, top of the box office was Silence of the Lambs, released back in February in the US, with Robin Hood arriving in late July and Terminator 2 in late August. So with the slightly odd situation of there being 2 songs in the top 5, Bryan Adams and Guns N' Roses' You Could Be Mine from Terminator 2, acting as trailers for films that weren't out yet, it's time to talk F1. The Benetton team had filled the void left by the departure of John Barnard with Tom Walkinshaw, boss of TWR Racing, who started immediately taking charge of the technical side of things, with Flavio Briatore doing the organisational, financial and sponsorship side as before. But Walkinshaw wouldn't be employed by Benetton. With the knitwear family apparently beginning to lose interest in the team, the Scottish entrepreneur had bought a 35% stake in the team, and plans were put in place to move the team, currently spread across sites in Godalming and Witney, nearly 2 hours' drive apart and on opposite sides of London, to TWR's Jaguar facility at Enstone, a picturesque little village near Chipping Norton in Oxfordshire, with a former World War II airbase, which was now a small civilian airfield, but with a decent runway handy for those flyaway races. Walkinshaw was a busy man indeed, because he was also chair of the British Racing Drivers Club, the owners of the Silverstone circuit, who had extensively revised the circuit since last year. Beckett's Corner at the eastern point of the circuit had been much reduced, changed to a challenging series from Maggots through Chapel. A sequence of corners called Vale was added at the south of the track, designed to be a good overtaking spot, and at the end of the lap, a flat-out blind right-hander at Bridge led into a new complex of corners, slowing the cars down at the end of the lap for the spectators, before heading into a slightly straightened-out woodcut. The track was no longer the foot-to-the-floor blast it used to be, but drivers felt it might be more interesting and challenging to drive, and were looking forward to finding out. After 3 races of distinct underperformance, McLaren had pushed the boat out, arriving with 5 chassis and 4 engines, giving both drivers the choice of either the Spec 2 or Spec 3 V12s, the latter a shorter-stroking, higher-revving version that ought to be less thirsty. But things were not well within the McLaren camp. Osamu Goto, who had recently resigned as head of Honda Sport, was seen in the paddock chatting with Ron Dennis, but remaining tight-lipped when asked about their current woes, and indeed rumours that test driver Alan McNish had been running the MP46 with last year's V10 engine at Suzuka and going much better. Ayrton Senna, for his part, was said to be delaying entering new contract negotiations until Ron Dennis could promise improvements to the car, while McLaren's Creighton Brown and Patrick Head had been having secret talks just in case an agreement couldn't be reached. The $24 million a year contract that Senna wanted could be doable if Camel Renault and the rest forked out, but Mansell and his contractual number 1 status would be the stumbling block. In fact, it almost seemed like Patrick Head was trying to get Mansell to quit, because in conversation with French journalists he said that Mansell's Canada retirement had indeed been as rumoured that he was waving to the crowd and stalled, and also opined that Nigel just lacked his teammate's sensitivity about car issues. Quote, Patrese feels it when his engine is failing. Mansell notices it when it breaks. Of course, none of that was known to the 100,000 screaming Mansell fans who packed the circuit for all 3 days to watch their man triumph, they hoped, for the 3rd time on home soil. He'd won at Brands in 1986 and at Silverstone in 1987, but hadn't had much luck at home of late and was keen to put that right. Sterling Moss popped in to congratulate him on breaking his record in France last week, and Nigel was also keen to introduce one of his own protégés, Paul Warwick, Derek's younger brother, who at 22 was currently driving for the newly renamed Mansell-Madgwick team in British Formula 3000. Paul Warwick had done a Senna, winning all 4 of the first 4 races of the season and looked like a hot prospect for the future. Ferrari were in cautiously celebratory mood for their part. Race day would mark the exact 40th anniversary of their first F1 win right here at a very different Silverstone, with Argentine Jose Froilan Gonzalez at the wheel, and indeed Ferrari had won here last year and might have had a 1-2 if not for Mansell's gearbox woes, but while Prost was happy with the new 643 chassis, the team were clear that a podium was the limit of their expectations this year, while Alain himself was still muttering darkly about a shadowy cabal within the team trying to oust him, claiming that, at Ferrari there are 10 or 20% of people who want Senna in my place and are leading a secret campaign. And of course, being race 8 of 16, the British Grand Prix would be important to the smaller teams, as after this race the Prix qualifiers would be reshuffled. Jordan and Dallara were almost certainly going to be out of PQ with 9 and 5 points respectively, with the Modena Lamborghini team also set to be missing the morning sessions on the strength of that 9th place for Van der Poel at Imola, unless somebody else did better. Into their place, unless they pulled something out of the hat today, would go Brabham, Footwork and AGS. The current PQ lineup took to the new layout early on Friday morning, with Gabriele Rumi fuming at Brian Hart, who had only supplied him with a single 1991 spec Cosworth, which Guillard had broken at Magny-Cours, so the Fonmetal mechanics had to fit a leftover 1990 spec unit instead, while casting envious eyes at the 7 1991 spec blocks knocking around the Footwork garage, which incidentally was still sans Alex Caffey while the legalities were sorted out, so Stefan Johansson's stint was extended by at least one more race. With little chance of matching the Dallaras and Jordans with last year's engine, Guillard was still at least in touch with them, and some distance ahead of the abject Lambos, not that that was any consolation as his last chance of escaping PQ evaporated. Slowest of the bunch as ever was Pedro Chaves, whose Portuguese sponsors had reportedly not ponied up the full amount promised, leaving the team able to run day to day but not do any development. Friday qualifying saw the drivers getting used to the new track. Most pronounced themselves delighted with it, although it was a little bit bumpy, and the advertising hoardings at Bridge made the corner very tricky to see round. Everyone except Andrea de Cesaris improved their times on Saturday, which was unfortunate for Andrea because he'd been 5th on Friday. Nigel Mansell always reckoned the fans were worth an extra second a lap to him at Silverstone, and he was indeed just a second ahead of Patrese when the dust settled, though a spirited drive by Senna put himself on the front row at least, 0.68 seconds behind Mansell. Berger was 4th after breaking one of those new Spec 3 engines on Friday and another one on Saturday, same problems at Magny-Cours, with the Ferraris 5th and 6th after taking time to dial in the settings. The Benettons took up row 4, 2.5 seconds behind Mansell, with Gugelmin 9th despite his Leighton really not enjoying the bumps, and Modena 10th in the Tyrrell, coincidentally both of those drivers on row 5 marking their 50th Grand Prix. Leto was 11th in the Dallara, with Blundell and Brundle giving it their best for Brabham in 12th and 14th. They needed to finish 7th or better to escape pre-qualifying, with De Cesaris 13th. Capelli in the second Leighton House was 16th. Minardi began their 100th Grand Prix from 20th, Morbidelli, and 23rd, Martini, bracketing the LaRousse Lolas, with the Loti and Michele Alboreto in his 150th Grand Prix, milestone central at Silverstone, bringing up the rear, and 5.2 seconds off Mansell's pole time. His teammate Johansson logged yet another failure to qualify, alongside Eric Comas and the AGS's, who were therefore also doomed to PQ, 2 seconds off the back of the grid and over 7 seconds off the front of it. Under that rarest of things, a beautiful blue English sky, the teams got ready for the race, making final tyre and engine choices. Senna decided to go with the newer Spec 3 Honda, while Berger went for reliability in the Spec 2. Tyre-wise, the majority of the Goodyear runners were on the soft C compounds, though Lotus and Footwork starting at the back decided to risk the slower but hardier Bs and try and run non-stop. The Pirelli tyres don't seem to have been enjoying the circuit at all, and the Tyrrell, Benetton, Brabham and Dallara cars were all expected to make a stop either way. The BBC were happily showing off their new overhead remote camera on rails over the pit lane as the cars began heading out to the grid, with Mansell having been fastest in the warm-up but Andrea De Cesaris second, which didn't improve Senna's mood at all. Incidentally, the footage I have access to for this race is the full BBC extended coverage but in a really bad VHS transfer and a much better quality highlights package thanks to Big Zeddy, so brace yourselves for some video quality whiplash. Mansell led them all round the parade lap under blazing skies except for Alboreto, who had an oil leak and would start from the pit lane, and then it was time to go. After a long hold, it was Senna who got the drop on Mansell and went into the first corner in the lead, with the Williams glued to his rear wing, while Patrese was poked into a spin by Berger and ended up backwards, then nearly collected Alesi as he recovered, while the incident had cleared the way for Roberto Moreno to leap up to third after a cracking start. Senna's lead lasted for all of half a lap before Mansell reasserted himself into Stowe to a roar from the crowd, while Patrese turned round to retire his damaged car. He did ask the stewards to penalise Berger for causing the incident, but it was decreed just one of those things and no more came of it. Post-race analysis of the footage showed that Riccardo had actually crowded Gerhard out and left him with nowhere to go, so it had really been somewhat self-inflicted. At the end of lap 1 then, the top 10 was Mansell, Senna, Moreno, Berger, Prost, Gugelmin, Modena, Alesi, Piquet and Leto. Berger was going a bit cautiously as he worked out if his suspension was damaged. It actually was, but not enough to make a difference, so the top 3 were rapidly pulling away, and Mansell in his turn was rapidly pulling away from them. After 3 laps he was over 4 seconds ahead, while Berger had decided his car was okay and motored up behind Moreno, keen to get a good result after his recent woes. He was passed at Vale shortly afterwards, as behind him and off-screen, Alesi went ahead of Modena into 7th, before attaching himself to the back of what was now a 4-way scrap, with Modena, Prost and Gugelmin. The Benetton was definitely struggling on its Pirelli tyres as Berger disappeared off ahead of him, and on lap 6 Prost got by into Stowe and set about pursuing the leaders. Mansell by now 8 seconds ahead of Senna, as Alesi got past Gugelmin off-camera. Also off-camera and charging was De Cesaris, who was up to 10th, having passed both Brabhams and both Dallaras since the start. The cameras did catch Alesi going past Moreno at the new Priory Bend, as Prost was lapping fastest except for Mansell and had now caught Berger, with Alesi also bearing down on the pair of them. But if the McLaren Honda V12 wasn't quite right, it still had the legs of the Ferrari V12, and Berger was able to defend his third place, for the time being at least, though not through lack of trying on the part of Prost. Soon Alesi was right up with the pair as well, as Gugelmin dropped out of his promising position to have his blistered tyres changed and his delaminating undertray looked at. A lap later, on lap 11, De Cesaris also had to come in with blistered tyres, the price for his charge up the field. With Mansell far out in front and Senna a lonely second, the Berger-Prost-Alesi scrap was the best viewing on track. On lap 14, Alesi made a very brave move, taking bridge flat and then outbraking Prost into Priory, and set about seeing if he could do any better at getting ahead of Berger than his illustrious teammate. Prost, for his part, seemed happy enough to drop back a bit and watch as Alesi flew at the McLaren without much more success. On lap 20, around 1/3 distance, Mansell led Senna by 18 seconds, with the Berger-Alesi-Prost scrap 3.5 seconds or so behind him, then Moreno 6th, Piquet 7th, Modena 8th, and Gachot 9th, the Jordan also on a charge and shaping up to pass the Tyrrell. Capelli, meanwhile, had already climbed out of his car prematurely for the 8th race in succession, this time a gear selection problem spinning him out at Priory. Ivan had been the second retirement after Patrese, and now there were 2 more, as on lap 22 both Bernard and Moreno parked up with transmission and gearbox problems respectively, which promoted the Brabham boys to 9th and 10th in pursuit of that vital 7th place. The McLarens were coming through the first of the backmarkers now, Gugelmin and Morbidelli both having made pit stops. Mauricio had had a $10,000 fine added to his time penalty in France and was keen not to repeat the experience, getting swiftly out of the way, and then Alesi pounced just as he had with Prost, using his momentum from the flat-out bridge corner to slingshot past at Priory from what looked like way too far back. Berger was so surprised that he ran wide and Prost went through too. Berger's tyres were in fact shot, with the first corner incidents having deranged his suspension just enough to put abnormal loads particularly on the left front, and with the Ferraris now past he immediately pitted to change rubber. It was a decent stop, putting him back out behind Piquet in 6th. Senna had never been very far ahead of Berger, and now the 2 Ferraris were charging once more in pursuit of the second-place McLaren, now some 17.5 seconds behind Mansell, who was by now lapping 15th placed Martini and 14th placed Herbert, going well in the Lotus, while Gugelmin came in to give it up as a bad job, the vibration from his disintegrating undertray making the car undrivable. Alesi and Prost were trading fastest laps, but couldn't make much impression on Senna's 6-second lead, while behind them Berger was also charging in pursuit of Piquet in 5th place and setting fastest laps of his own, and behind him Brundle was in trouble, falling behind Blundell and then coming in to retire with a broken throttle linkage, leaving the fate of the Brabham team in the hands of his impressive young teammate. Prost, not used to eating Alesi's dust, had a very graceful spin at Vale when he wiped his visor at just the wrong moment, getting it moving again with no harm done other than a bit of time lost, just as Hakkinen, running 17th, also had an off-track excursion of his own, with again no harm done, but he came in for some clean tyres. It was a shocking few minutes for Maranello, as Alesi clobbered Suzuki as he was lapping him, sending the Lola out and the Ferrari into the pits with a nose as crooked as Alain Prost. Alesi had tried the bridge Priory trick again, but this time it was too far back, and the move had backfired. In the meantime, Piquet had pitted for tyres, so just before half-distance the order was Mansell leading Senna by 24 seconds, with Prost third, 12 seconds behind Senna, Berger 4th, 24 seconds behind Prost, but only 9 seconds ahead of a still-charging Gachot, with Modena still hanging on to the last point, with Piquet 7th and Blundell 8th, while De Cesaris had disposed of Herbert and Martini again and was back in the top 10 as he tried to recover from his early stop. With a big gap and half the race gone, and hoping not to have to stop, Mansell eased off a bit, but was still pulling away slowly from Senna, who was in turn losing ground slowly but surely to Prost. Unfortunately for Nigel, one of the balancing weights in his rear wheels had worked loose, and he peeled in to make a precautionary stop. A slick stop got him out still in the lead, but only just, with Senna now just a couple of seconds behind, but stymied by having to lap De Cesaris, who was in turn lapping Hakkinen. It took Senna 3 frustrating laps to get past Andrea, by which time Mansell had pulled away again, had warmed up his tyres and was out of danger. Before long the gap was back up to a comfortable 6 seconds and increasing. Mark Blundell pitted for tyres too, a quick stop but still dropping him further behind than he needed to be, but he gained 1 place not long afterwards, when Andrea De Cesaris had a big off at bridge, smacking into the wall and bouncing off, shedding bits of car as he crossed the track, nearly collecting Satoru Nakajima, while Alain Prost, arriving to lap both of them, also narrowly avoided the incident, but picked up a shard of carbon fibre in his tyre and had to come in to change them, and then couldn't get his car in gear and was stationary for 9 seconds, dropping to 4th behind the 2 McLarens. While Prost charged to catch up, Mansell had just lapped Piquet and Modena, and Nelson took the opportunity to elbow his way past the Tyrrell into the points and set off in pursuit of Gachot, who was struggling on worn tyres. With 10 laps to go, the drama was mostly in the timing sheets rather than on the track, as Prost chased Berger, who responded by setting a new fastest lap, while Piquet chased Gachot, and Mansell cruised away serenely in the lead. As the laps ticked down, the crowd's anticipation was palpable, but everyone's memories of Canada were still very fresh, and there was a nervous edge to it as Mansell lapped Gachot. Mark Blundell's engine expired with just 6 laps to go, consigning Brabham to pre-qualifying and giving us another classic Murrayism.
Well, there's no damage to the car there except to the car itself.
Mansell was having problems of his own too, with a gear selection problem starting to make itself known with just 2 laps to go. Rather than risk it, Nigel decided to simply stay in 5th gear, with enough of a lead to lose time in the slow sections and still win. Starting his last lap, he was still 25 seconds ahead. Piquet took 5th off Gachot on their penultimate lap, and then on lap 59 there was one last twist as the crowd got to their feet and the Union Jacks waved. But just for once, it wasn't late heartbreak for Mansell, who risked a wave to the fans as he rounded Woodcote to take the checkered flag. It was Senna, rolling to a stop out of fuel on the very last lap. He'd still be 4th, having lapped everyone up to Piquet, but Gerhard Berger swept gratefully through to take a very welcome 2nd place after all his recent tribulations, with Prost a satisfied 3rd, having done just what his team asked of him. Piquet and Gachot finished off the scorers, Jordan now having scored at the last 4 races in a row. Mansell was thoroughly enjoying himself on the slowing down lap and pulled over next to Senna's stricken McLaren. Ayrton hopped on board the side pod, fended off an official, and off they went with the rear-facing camera on the Williams getting some great footage. It was a grand chelem for Mansell, pole position, fastest lap, and the win leading every lap. It could hardly have been a more dominant performance, and if the race was a little dull at the front as the result, the crowd didn't care. The Tyrrells finished 7th and 8th, the Minardis 9th and 11th, sandwiching Pirro, with Hakkinen and Leto the last remaining runners, with Herbert's oil pressure having stopped him a couple of laps from the end, but having gone far enough to be classified 14th. So thanks to Senna's misfortune, Mansell closed the gap to a more doable 18 points, and would go into the second half of the season confident in having the momentum, despite Senna's initial big lead. Despite Patrese's early exit, Williams did put 1 more point than McLaren on the board, to close the gap in the Constructors' race to 12 points. In 2 weeks' time, everyone would reconvene at the Hockenheim Ring for the German Grand Prix, with the Jordan, Scuderia Italia and Modena mechanics all looking forward to missing the early morning Friday sessions, and the Footwork, Brabham and AGS squads taking their place.